And so I have really been privileged, I think, having been raised in a family where my father was a Navy officer, 20 years in the Navy, served in World War II and the Korean War. And so I was really quite hawkish on nuclear weapons issues, on the Vietnam War, when I started my undergraduate career in 1968. Fairly conservative school, Purdue University. I was majoring in engineering. But in that first semester that I was going, there was a recruiting booth that Dow Chemical had on campus, and students were protesting. And they were protesting with a big blown-up photograph. You probably remember it, the iconic photograph of the little girl who was napalmed. And here I was, this person brought up in a military family with very militaristic ideology, and that stopped me. And so this was an ethical issue. That's one thing I love about, I think all people of goodwill, whether they're rooted in a spiritual tradition or otherwise, all people of goodwill need to join together on these kinds of issues. And so here I was saying, that is not right. We're not the good guys in the white hats, the way I've been told. We're doing this to little children in Vietnam, and something's wrong with this. And so I did turn to the movements that were going on, especially the U.S. peace movement. I turned to my faith tradition and the campus ministry. And I discovered that something that was right at the heart of all the great ethical traditions in the world was the call to peacemaking and the call to preserve life. This is really fundamental. To preserve life. And I felt more and more of a connection to that call, that sense of direction in my life. And so I felt called into becoming a minister, went to seminary for 4 years in Ohio, so I was a Midwesterner for a long time. And then I took a call to a church in Washington, D.C., 6 blocks from the White House. Boy, was that convenient to go to a lot of demonstrations. I tell you, I had no shortage of opportunities. Lots of protest opportunities. And by then, that was really my passion for ministry. My passion in life has really been the call to peacemaking. The call to preserve and affirm and let us all experience the life that I think we are created for. And so I've been so privileged, I think, to have been on this journey now, full-time for 42 years. I'll share a little bit of good news, and actually it's implicit there at the top with the fact that, and I like the way it starts, we had 75,000 nuclear weapons in the world not that long ago. When I started this organizing 42 years ago, that's how many nuclear weapons we had. They had to invent a new word for it, overkill. Okay? And, we engaged through these different forums that I was part of, Mobilization for Survival, now the Coalition for Peace Action, which was part of the Nuclear Freeze. I helped launch the National Nuclear Freeze campaign. And through that organizing, which by the way used the classic means of democracy, that's one of the things I like. I think there's a whole menu of options in the nonviolent social change effort. But one of the things that was so appealing, I think, about the Nuclear Freeze campaign in particular, is that we used the classic means of democracy to effectuate major change. We did petition drives. We had referenda, starting in Western Massachusetts and then becoming the closest thing we've ever had to a national referendum was 1982. when the nuclear freeze was on the statewide ballot in 10 states and 60 counties and municipalities, and overwhelmingly the American people approved it. We had the second highest approval rate in New Jersey, which I was the co-chair of that effort, was 66% voted yes. And our Republican governor at the time, Tom Kean, was the honorary co-chair of that campaign. So this is one of the things that I think is so exciting, is we use these classic means of democracy to bring this issue forward, to work on it through lobbying, through advocacy, through media work, not only lobby visits to Washington, but a lot of lobby visits and advocacy. And in those days it was pre-internet, so you had to do letter writing and phone calling to try to impact your member of Congress. And we did that so effectively that President Reagan, who had come in talking about fighting and winning a nuclear war, his top echelon was talking about that. Unfortunately, that's come back, but I'll come back to that later. The idea that you could somehow fight and win a nuclear war. So that a lot of people got frightened. It's why they were, just like I was frightened in 1962. A lot of people were frightened that we were going to have a nuclear war because of all this nuclear saber rattling. Our Assistant Secretary of Defense, T.K. Jones, said, with enough shovels, we're all going to survive. I mean, there's a lot of harebrained ideas out there, but this was one of the worst. Saying all you got to do is go out to the countryside as if the roads aren't going to be jammed, preventing you from getting out to the countryside. All you got to do is go out, take a door with you, dig a hole, put the door over it, and you're going to survive. That was their solution. We're safe because we can survive a nuclear war doing that. I mean, this was real lunacy. And so we lived through a very frightening time, but that fear led people to become involved in positive social change. That's what brings transformation. Positive social change, working together as a team. It's not a lone ranger, it's not any one organization, it's a movement. All of us working together as a team. We reversed President Reagan when he first took office. He says, no, Soviet Union is an evil empire. I'm not going to even talk to them. You can't deal with those evil people. And he came under so much pressure that he had to restart negotiations with the Soviets. And of course, in restarting negotiations, he had to come up with a U.S. proposal, a U.S. position, and it was the so-called 0-0 option. 0 medium-range nuclear weapons on each side, Soviet side and the U.S. Western side. And he did it as a PR stunt, mostly. He knew that the Soviets at the time would reject it, because they already had a lot of these medium-range nuclear weapons deployed, and we had 0. And they did, predictably, but then in 1985, something strange happened. Something unexpected happened. A guy named Mikhail Gorbachev came into power, an atheist, by the way. And he said, let's change things. I'll take that offer of 0-0. And by 1987, we had the first nuclear reduction treaty in history. That led to more all the way up through 2010, when the New START treaty was agreed to. That's how we got from 75,000 down to 15,000. That's progress, but unfortunately it's still overkill. So that's the good news. We, the people, have come together in the fairly recent past, right up through 2010. We, the people, using the classic means of democracy, have brought about major social change, which has led to the elimination of 50,000 nuclear weapons so far. So far, that's right. Give ourselves a hand, because I think many of you were involved in that. And you know, one thing we sometimes do in the peace movement and other social change movements is we don't pause and take enough time to celebrate our victories. We've made really major progress. It's just not enough. 15,000 is still in the overkill range. That's why our second bullet point there even a tiny fraction of these weapons would cause worldwide climate disruption and global famine. So this really is primarily come from the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Some of you know of that group. It was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for their excellent work at trying to reduce the nuclear danger. And I know some of the people that did this study with them and for them, top experts. And they said, what would happen in a limited nuclear war, what some people are saying we could fight and win that kind of war, what would happen if just 50 nuclear weapons were used by India and Pakistan, which one of the most likely places, by the way, where nuclear weapons might get used? What would be the outcome of that? And as you see there, the amount of soot that would be put into the atmosphere, you of course are going to have a lot of people, because mostly those 50 nuclear weapons are going to be falling on major cities that are heavily populated in that part of the world. But you would have a situation where a fairly small portion of those 15,000 nuclear weapons would lead to the eventual starvation of 2 billion people. Over 1/3 of humanity would die from the use of a tiny fraction of those 15,000 nuclear weapons. This is one of the scary things about the intersectionality. You know, we had studies coming out, even back in the 1980s, on nuclear winter, but we've learned a lot more about it. And I'm thankfully know personally some of the top scientists in the world, both on the nuclear weapons issue and on the climate crisis. And these two are inextricably interwoven as far as the threat that they present every day, the threat that they present to the survival of humanity. So, despite assurances that we've had, even back to the Cuban Missile Crisis days, but many more since then, despite assurances that these weapons are never going to be used, that they're doomsday weapons, which they are, and therefore nobody who is quote-unquote sane would use them, despite that, there are numerous times where it has been seriously considered as an intentional decision, numerous times. And you can go to the link that's there if you want to look those up. But I want to talk to you about something much more recent that I think you can really relate to, which was the drone killing of Soleimani just a few months ago. You know, this was a perfect example of how miscalculation can lead us to the point of being on the brink of war. That's why this campaign that I'm talking with you about, it's an international campaign. Many groups here in the US, including Peace Action, are involved in it, Back from the Brink. So we have this challenge of trying to back up. So the Soleimani strike is a perfect example of how you can slide into a war, even a nuclear war, with no intention of doing that. So the start of this was the US saying that it was going to pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement and therefore reimpose these draconian sanctions on Iran. Okay? You all remember that. That was a gargantuan miscalculation, and I'm using the term gargantuan intentionally, by the way. It's hard to think of a worse miscalculation, because what did that lead to? Well, the Trump administration was saying, well, they'll just cower in their boots and they'll come back to the negotiating table and make the kind of agreement we want them to have with us. And so Iran didn't respond that way, as you know. And in fact, Iran started to do various aggressive things with various military formations they have that bothered the US, so things were going in the wrong direction. And ultimately, Iran decided, you know what? this situation is going to make us go back to producing the nuclear materials from 2013 to just about a week ago. Iran did not have enough nuclear weapons grade material to make even one bomb. That changed exactly a week ago. Why? Because Iran said they have no reason to try to comply with that agreement now. The US has withdrawn from it, has torpedoed it. And so that was a huge, gargantuan miscalculation. Iran, for its part, also made a miscalculation. Iran thought that if we just shoot some missiles back at the US, that they'll come back to the negotiating table. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. And for tragic reasons, as you know, Iran, thankfully no US troops were killed. We now know over 100 were brain damaged, brain injured. But also they mistakenly shot down a civilian airliner. And now, of course, they've got the virus happening over there. So they've been distracted by a lot of other things and restrained. But, you know, let me say this is the main point. When Trump ordered that strike, he was risking a major war with Iran, and we would be at war right now if it wasn't for good luck. It's good luck and nothing else. That's what Robert McNamara said, speaking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it was good luck mostly that we didn't have a nuclear war then. And so now we have, since 2010, and especially since Donald Trump took office, re-escalated the nuclear arms race. They call it modernization, but you know, they're pros, aren't they? Using misleading language, euphemisms, modernization, who could be against that? No, this is not modernization. This is escalation into a new nuclear arms race to the tune of 1.7 trillion. By the way, most economists are now saying probably 2 trillion or more. So that's on the low side, the $1.7 trillion. And it would create, everything would be brand new in our all three parts of our triad: land-based weapons, sea-based weapons, air-based weapons. All three of those would have brand new delivery vehicles, brand new nuclear weapons, much more dangerous, much more powerful. In fact, one of the scariest things is one of the new nuclear weapons has just been deployed within the last month. And that is the most ridiculous way of thinking I've ever heard of. There's absolutely no reason to think that. Once the nuclear threshold is crossed, all bets are off. And so we face this situation today. I have a very personal stake in it. I was almost going to say this when you were sharing your joys and concerns, because it is such a great joy in my life, is we just had our third grandchild born, February 18th, our first granddaughter. It's a great joy in my life to have these 3 new lives in our family. But are they going to have a future? With this kind of threat of perhaps immediate death? And this is not an overstatement. We're not talking about just large portions of humanity. We're talking about the possible extinction of humanity. That's what's facing us. That's what's at stake here. Make no mistake about it. This issue is thoroughly studied. Tiny fraction, 2 billion people potentially could die from a tiny fraction of those 15,000 nuclear weapons. As long as they exist, they will ultimately get used. That's the history of all weaponry. Once it's invented, once it's deployed, it eventually gets used. We've got to engage in the process of carrying that great momentum we started up through 2010 and keep reducing from 75,000, not just to 15,000, but down to 0. Now, one last word of hope before I turn it over to Ed to bring in this connection to the climate crisis for you, is that 2017, just a few years ago, the UN passed a nuclear ban treaty. Earlier, it had passed a ban on biological weapons, a ban on chemical weapons. The ban on chemical weapons is especially impressive because it has very intrusive and strong inspections, just like the Iran nuclear agreement did before Trump pulled out of it. So these things are verifiable. They're not based just on trust. They're verifiable. And so there is a nuclear ban treaty in place. Unfortunately, none of the nuclear nations have signed it. They need to feel the heat from their grassroots. That's our job. Because this is what is needed for your children, my children, our loved ones, our grandchildren, future generations. The future of humanity is at stake here. And especially the least of these among us. Because when we're spending money on nuclear weapons, instead of on meeting the needs of the least of these, then we're becoming weaker. Millions are suffering and taking the place of the have-nots. When we spend money on nuclear weapons instead of on the climate crisis, and there are real ways we can address the climate crisis still, as late as it is, and as scary as it is. And so I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to ask Ed to come up now and conclude for us.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thank you for having us today. So Kate Esposito had asked for a personal recollection, and I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to a great man, Dr. Freeman Dyson, who passed away very recently. He was a leader for peace for many years, but he started out, I don't know how many people know this, he started out with the British Army. And in fact, he was a scientist and an engineer, and he was helping to design bomb bays for the Lancaster bomber to bomb German cities. And he came to realize, as you know, he learned what was actually happening, that these were not military targets, these were civilian targets. So he quit the Royal Air Force and Army, I believe he was with the Air Force, and he became a peace person for many years. He recently passed away in Princeton, where he was a professor for many years and a leader in the Coalition for Peace Action, advisor for us. So I want to just pay tribute to Freeman Dyson today. So just very briefly, because I know we all want to get to coffee and maybe have some discussion afterwards, I want you to please take a look at your handout, the side of the sheet that says, "From nuclear madness to a green peace economy." And you'll see there two maps. The smaller, lower map is nuclear weapons facilities and jobs. And it's kind of amazing, since we spend close to $100 billion on nuclear weapons and delivery systems, and the Energy Department, which is actually mostly about nuclear weapons. It's kind of amazing that that entire complex only provides 139,000 civilian jobs, which is really a pittance for all that, you know, for money that's going simply to develop weapons of war. By contrast, if you look at the top map, this is a reliable estimate from another person we work with at Nuclear Ban US, whose name is Willis, Timon Willis. And Dr. Willis has developed this map of what we could do in the next 10 years to develop jobs in solar energy, offshore wind, onshore wind energy, hydroelectric, tidal, geothermal, and reforestation. Reforestation is interesting because many countries around the world are coming to realize But reforestation helps to absorb the carbon dioxide in a naturalistic way. And so that is a relatively new one, but we can do all of these things and gain at least 7.9 million jobs. I've heard Bernie Sanders use much higher estimates, 15 to 20 million jobs, but I'll take 8 million, you know.
Amen.
I'll be happy with 8 million. So that's the first part. Take the money now in new nukes, you know, being used for things like usable nukes, as Bob was mentioning, and use it instead to cut the US carbon footprint. The Pentagon has a higher carbon footprint than most nations. Let me repeat that. The Pentagon, one organization, has a larger carbon footprint with all the tanks and armor and jet planes and everything else than many nations. So what we need is to transform it into a green world economy. The UN is actually taking the lead on this in the absence of the US, which is not. At the Madrid Climate Conference, 65 nations stepped up and presented serious plans to cut carbon dioxide pollution. 70 additional nations announced they were working on new plans, and the US could help with technical assistance, I believe, if we had a new team and a new plan. So I hope everyone goes out and votes this November. Finally, climate justice. What we mean about this as we invest in a green new economy, let's do it so that many jobs are focused in the inner cities and underserved rural areas. Imagine replacing an incinerator in Southwest Philadelphia, which is creating asthma for many children, and instead having a manufacturing plant for wind turbines or solar panels. This can happen, it just takes the investment. Imagine building electric cars in Chester, Pennsylvania, or Camden, New Jersey, so you can have, you know, carbon-free transportation. Providing hope and well-paid jobs for many people in those areas. Now, some of these folks are climate refugees from places like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, US citizens who have had to migrate here against their will, really, because of earthquakes and hurricanes and government neglect, as well as people from Haiti and West Africa. There is a project. I'm also on the board of the UN Association of Greater Philadelphia, and Christian is here, who is our fearless leader on that board. And there is another board member from the Alpha Kappa Alpha African American sorority, college sorority from around the country, who is working with these refugees, and we hope to help her on that project. Finally, Earth Day 50. The 50th anniversary of Earth Day is this April 22nd. We're in touch with student leaders who are leading the climate strike that day at various colleges around the city. And we're lucky to say that that week and possibly that day, we will have Judy Wicks. Many of you know Judy, who has been a leader in sustainable business, and Judy, who has been a leader in sustainable business and peace for many years. So she has agreed to come and address us about her new project, which is called All Together Now, about building sustainable businesses locally. I just want to give you a very quick quote from them. So it's called All Together Now, which envisions, quote, a prosperous network of just and resilient regional economies of independent, locally owned businesses and farms, which build community wealth, reduce carbon emissions, decrease reliance on global supply chains, and prepare our communities for climate change by producing basic needs locally and sustainably. So these are all things that we can participate in. We don't have to just stand by and watch the government, mess up on coronavirus and on the climate issue. There's much that we can do, and I hope you'll work with us. Thanks very much.